Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Garrett Dash Nelson. I'm the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And you're tuned in this evening for Professor Julia Lewandoski on mapping French and Indigenous land after the Quebec Act. This is part of our Richard H. Brown seminar on the historical geography of the American Revolutionary War era. The Brown Seminar is part of our American Revolutionary Geographies Online, or ARGO project. Professor Lewandoski and I will also be joined by Dr. Alexandra Montgomery from the Center for Digital History at George Washington's Mount Vernon, our partners on the ARGO project. You can visit argomaps.org to find more maps, materials, and interpretive essays about the American Revolutionary period as seen from a geographic and cartographic perspective. Before we begin the program today, I'd like to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to Indigenous peoples. The Massachusetts people lived for thousands of years and still live today on the Shawmut Peninsula. The Boston metropolitan region is also home to other tribes, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag and the Nipmuc Nations. Copley Square, where the Central Library is located, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in all of North America. The maps that are in the Boston Public Library collections and in our partner collections in the ARGO project bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but to conflicts that range from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, the maps in our collections don't simply document these stories, but actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all of our programming, interpretation, and educational work, we encourage visitors and listeners to consider and reflect how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. For tonight's Brown Seminar, I'm joined by Professor Julia Lewandoski. Professor Lewandoski is Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, San Diego. She's a historian of Indigenous peoples, cartography, and empire in early North America, and is currently at work on her first book, Land Tenure Survival, Imperial Law and Indigenous Creativity in the Treaty Era, which explores Indigenous land ownership under successive imperial regimes in 18th and 19th century Quebec, Louisiana, and Southern California. I'd like to welcome Professor Lewandoski to the program. Hi, Julia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, and I can't wait to hear your talk today. For those of you tuning in online from either Facebook or YouTube, you can drop comments and questions in the chat at any time. Professor Lewandoski will introduce her research and show us some images of maps and other materials, after which Dr. Montgomery, Professor Lewandoski, and I will have a short conversation, and then we'll invite Q&A from the audience. You can ask a question at any time, and we'll keep it in the running chat. So Julia, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll let you introduce your work.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Thanks so much to Garrett and Kiana and Ala for inviting me to be part of this seminar and program. This great series at the Leventhal Map Center. I'm speaking to you from my office in La Jolla, California, on the ancestral and present territories of the Kumeyaay peoples. But don't worry, I grew up in New England and in Vermont specifically, so I do have some bona fides for talking about the part of the world that I'm going to talk about today, which is specifically Quebec's St. Lawrence Valley. So today I want to talk about one map in particular, and first I'll sort of walk you through why I got interested in this map in the first place. What makes it sort of different and stand out from the way that historians often talk about maps, particularly property maps made in the late 18th century Enlightenment era. And then second, I'll talk a little bit more about the particular historical circumstances that caused this map to come into being. So here is the map. It is dated December 25th, Christmas, 1798, and it was made by Theodore de Pincier, who was a Hessian mercenary, essentially, in the Revolutionary War, and then was working as a surveyor for the British province of Quebec, sometimes called Lower Canada at this time as well. So I'll sort of use Quebec and Lower Canada interchangeably. And so this map depicts the lands of Abenaki and Sokoke Indians, who are part of this much larger Wabanaki Confederacy, at their village of Odenak, which is on the St. Francis River in southeastern Quebec. So here you can see on this map from 1776, the sort of larger labeling of Abenaki territory, and then the high-tech arrows that I've put in that sort of show you the vicinity of the village and where Odenak is being mapped. And so the first thing that you might notice, you might have already noticed about the map, Dupintier's map, is that it is chaotic. It is a very messy and complicated document. It doesn't show us a lot of clarity. Starting with even just its orientation, right? It doesn't have a north-south orientation. To make it sort of make sense, we would want to twist it like that. And then probably the largest element of the sort of chaos of the map is how much writing there is on it. So if we sort of zoom in, we can see that it is essentially full of remarks and explanations that go on for paragraphs and paragraphs. So essentially what this map is showing us is that for the surveyor, for the map maker, spatial representation itself is essentially breaking down as a way of getting information across, right? He has to sort of resort to these textual explanations instead. So beyond all of these remarks and explanations, we also see it has competing lines, right? So instead of sort of drawing clear boundary lines when we zoom in, we see things like lines with labels. For example, on this sort of detail, it says, you know, the real line of the Abenakis, you know, according to the survey line of August 5th, 1713, right? So there's a sort of resorting to sort of time and multiple markers instead of just saying, you know, here's where the boundary is. These sort of competing lines even become somewhat subjective. Here we have another line, and this one says, you know, the real line of the Abenakis according to their opinion, right? This element of sort of revealing that there's disagreement about where the boundary lines are. And so this makes it a very interesting map to me, in particular, because usually maps don't really display that amount of ambiguity, right? Often what maps are trying to do is resolve the ambiguity rather than just show it. And in fact, Dupintier, he sort of submits this map to his boss, Joseph Bouchette, the Surveyor General of Lower Canada, and Bouchette makes a copy of it. So you can see that copy here on the right. And I believe this copy is in the Leventhal, the Argo collection as well. But as you can see, Bouchette, while he sort of cleans up the map, he doesn't resolve the ambiguity, right? We still have multiple lines. We still have all of these explanations and remarks. He just replicates this complexity. So that's a sort of introduction to the map. And let me just talk a little bit more about genres of mapping around this time, 1798, because that'll show you why I think this map is so striking, right? So what I'm arguing is that this map really tries to display unresolved complexity and uncertainty, and in some ways sort of gives up on the endeavor of spatial representation altogether and sort of resorts to writing. And that makes it really different from a lot of maps in this era that we look at, and also sort of the general trend of the way historians talk about mapping and the sort of project of map making during this time, right? So in the late 18th century, we're still in sort of the era of imperial claims, right? And historians talk about how maps were one of these sort of central techniques of, empires staking their claim to space on paper, even though in reality on the ground their claims were so much shakier, right? And so this sort of 1755 map is a really classic example of this sort of vision of like, well, what if we just extend the lines of the colonies all the way to the Rocky Mountains? Look how big Virginia would be. We have this in some of the first maps made of the United States after the American Revolution in this 1784 Buell map. As you can see, it just sort of confidently extends the lines of these new states all the way to the Mississippi River. And so what these maps really do is express just a lot more authority, both authority in terms of political authority over that land and sort of authority just in terms of raw geographical knowledge, right? That empires and then these new, settler colonial states are claiming. Of course, this is also sort of fused with Enlightenment ideas about scientific accuracy and sort of investing in claims of, dispassionate, precise depictions of fixed reality, right? That maps are simply showing reality on the ground, and they're simply just about accuracy. And so, the stakes of these rhetorical techniques are really high because, in particular, these types of maps really mask the reality that this territory is majority indigenous land and that, you know, achieving sovereignty, especially for the US, what it's going to attempt to do in the 1790s in the Ohio Valley and what's called the Old Northwest, is going to be a violent campaign of military conquest, right? So they're sort of projecting that vision onto that map before they do the sort of actual work of conquest. So we could say, well, those are sort of large scale geopolitical maps. The map I'm talking about today is a small scale property map. And so if we think about it in terms of scale, perhaps property maps really are going to show us much more of the sort of fine grained, messy realities on the ground instead of making these sort of big, bold claims. But as it turns out, the way that historians talk specifically about cadastral or property mapping, and specifically during this time, the late 18th, very early 19th century, they talk about cadastral mapping in particular as the essential technique of the modernizing settler state, right? So this is very much inspired by the work of the influential anthropologist James C. Scott in his book Seeing Like a State. And he sort of talks about France sort of regularizing its property mapping during that period. And then in the North American context, this is when folks like Thomas Jefferson through the Northwest Ordinances are really expressing this vision of how, sort of boots on the ground, how settler colonialism will really happen, right? That it's by imagining space as this rational grid where everything has a number and everything's affixed to a meridian. That's how we will get settlers onto indigenous land, right? That's how they will occupy it. And essentially projecting this vision, right? That you can get your township square and you can go out there sight unseen and you'll be able to locate it. This is how Jefferson, and then also in British Canada, how the shapers of Upper Canada, what's now Ontario, are seeing sort of nation building at this time. And of course, underlying these sort of visions of the grid is the idea that what's under the grid is empty land, right? That there's some sort of blank slate for the grid to roll over on top of. So to go back to our map, I think it's pretty clear that that is not what's going on here, right? This map does not suggest a vision of mastery, of coherence, of sort of rational regularity, even though it's made, by the order of a British governor, by British authorities expressly located in British territory. It's really a vision, an admission, if you will, of confusion, uncertainty, ambiguity, and even sort of the failure of maps to do this kind of rhetorical work. So next, I'd like to sort of transition and talk about why this map came to be made and what's going on in the St. Lawrence Valley that makes cadastral mapping look so different. And that's where we get to the Quebec Act. So essentially, the British conquer French Quebec in 1759, and in the 1763 Treaty of Paris that they make, the treaty provisions allow French subjects to remain in Quebec and to remain with their property intact. And around 70,000 Francophone people did stay in the St. Lawrence Valley, and the majority of them were censitaires, meaning they were feudal tenants who held tiny strips of land under the French feudal system, also called seigneurialism. So here's a 1709 map of seigneurialism along the St. Lawrence River. And essentially, seigneurialism lays out these tiny sort of strips to tenants along the river. And as you can see, over time, those strips become subdivided and subdivided among children because they're heritable. And as you can imagine, this is a system that becomes sort of staggeringly complex and ambiguous by the time the British get there in 1763. So the question is, are the British going to just keep French feudalism, keep seigneurialism, or are they going to try to translate this into a more, quote, British, township system of property? And with the Quebec Act in 1774, they essentially signal that what they're going to do is just keep seigneurialism intact, right? They say that they're going to keep Catholicism, French law, and thus French land tenure. And so in the 1790s, where elsewhere, these sort of new gridded townships are being rolled out in places like Upper Canada and the Ohio Valley. In Lower Canada, in the St. Lawrence River Valley, surveyors are embarking on a very different project, and that's just trying to map the land tenure that already exists there. Here's a 1794 example of that. As you can see, sort of similar to our map, we have copious remarks and we have essentially a lot of text. If we look closer, essentially what they're trying to do is locate the date of the original concession of each one of these seigneuries so they can try to get a picture of where they are. So they're sort of like resorting to time as a way to sort of attempt clarity rather than just relying on space. And as you can see, sort of on the far right, it just says, granted at different times, see remarks. So this is really challenging in general. And our de Pincier's map fits into this sort of larger project of just trying to map seigneurialism, trying to figure out what's already there in Lower Canada. But of course, what's most significant about it is that it's a map of Indigenous territories. As the cartouche of Bouchet's copy of the map says, right, it is a plan of the lands of the Abenakis and Sokokis of the village of St. Francis. And then when we zoom into sort of details on de Pincier's map, we can also see sort of the label Abenakis is kind of all over the place. So The reason that this is so unusual is because essentially by this time, both the US and British Canada were trying to remove Indigenous people from property mapping altogether, right? So after 1763, the British basically decreed that private individuals aren't allowed to engage in land transaction with Indigenous nations, right? So the only way that Indigenous land is going to move into settler hands is through public treaties, right? Through treaties made with sovereigns who then will take that ceded land and transform it into property, right, by dividing it up into a grid. And so this is sort of nominally in the language of protection, and this is about protecting Indigenous land under British sovereignty. But what it really is about power, right? That the British government saying the crown is going to be the only source of title. We don't want other sovereigns. We don't want Indigenous sovereign nations as a source of title that settlers are going to, try to defend titles in court on the basis of. So that is the paradigm, right? The separation of Indigenous people from property maps. But in the St. Lawrence Valley, because French seigneurialism is being extended, one of the things that happens is that Indigenous people are already deeply entangled in seigneurialism by the time the British get there. In the case of Odanak, they have been missionized by French Jesuits who established a mission there in the early 1700s and were granted portions of 2 seigneuries as a part of that mission. And so after 1763, the British government sees Abenakis and other Native nations in St. Lawrence Valley and assumes that because they speak French, they practice Catholicism, and they seem to be settled in these sort of mission villages, what they call domiciled, right? That these people are already conquered, right? So there's no need to make treaties with them that would cede their territories and create reserves, because that's just already been done by the process of French conquest, right? This is a fantasy. The French, they didn't make territorial cessions and create reserves. But this is how the British are sort of choosing to see this, right? And so on these 2 maps, sort of from 1776 to 1796, we can sort of see this transition, right? From this larger Abenaki territories in 1776, which by 1796 just becomes these delineated seigneury mission villages. To bring more complexity to the situation, right? So Abenakis, they don't have a treaty relationship, they don't have a diplomatic relationship with the British. The Jesuit order is suppressed worldwide. The Jesuits are recalled from Quebec. And so by the 1790s, Abenakis are living in what's nominally a mission village, but the missionaries are gone. And so part of what they are facing in the 1790s is an unusual amount of new encroachment from their neighbors, right? And this is in part because the sort of status of their land there's no clarity, right? It's not clear, are they the occupants? Are they the seigneurial proprietors? Are they tenants? Do they participate in the seigneurial or other property system at all? None of that's clear. But in the 1790s, the Abenakis and Sokokis at Odanak start to make that clear. And part of that project is asking the government to make this map for them. So in 1796, they enter a legal arbitration process with their neighbors over the particular boundaries of their seigneury, where one starts and the next seigneury begins. And then they're unhappy with the outcome of that mediation process. And so they petition the government, right? And essentially they say, you've claimed that you're the protector of Indigenous land. Please protect our land, right? Please come out here, and sort of tell your own settlers to stop encroaching, stop trespassing on our lands. And the British government's response is to send out this surveyor, and the surveyor makes this map, right? So this is really this response for Abenaki and Sokoki demand for sort of clarity, for the British to, sort of take the authority that they claim that they have, to clarify. And really, this map doesn't do that. It displays the lack of clarity, instead of sort of decisively creating clarity. And, to be fair to the surveyor, to Depinsier, this is something that was really above his pay grade. And he, in fact, complained often about his pay grade, to his boss, Joseph Bouchet. He wasn't happy about his surveyor salary. But he worked hard, and his notes on his sort of surveyor's notebook for making this map runs to about 150 pages. Here's an example of just a couple of those pages. And then, as you can see in red, this is the sort of index made by I think by an archivist. But as you can see, there are whole sections of it that are just essentially, again, remarks, differences of opinions, and just the challenges of trying to resolve this situation that essentially he, as just sort of a surveyor, right, whose job is to describe, essentially, is unable to resolve. So this brings us to this sort of third bigger assumption that's really interesting about this map, which is the role of Indigenous people, in property mapping, right? So I think often we think of Indigenous people are framed as sort of categorically opposed to something like property mapping, or that, land ownership isn't a concept they can understand. But that's just not this is not the case at Odanak. What's really clear is that they've already been involved in French land tenure for nearly a century, and in the 1790s, they're really clearly and actively seeking formalization of their lands at Odanak by a surveyor. How effective was this formalization? 1798, not very effective, right? This map doesn't really give them the clarification that they're looking for. But I do think that one of the things it does is sort of mark this beginning of an era of formalization of land at Odanak. So you can see on these two maps here from 1803 and 1813, these maps both sort of clearly label part of their seigneury as belonging to the Abenaki Indians, in a sort of trend of representing them as proprietors, as having authority over their lands in a new way. So I will close there. I know it's really complex, so I'm happy to answer anyone's questions and talk more. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julia. What a brilliant presentation. I could have you go on and on and on. And it's just such a cool deep dive into these super complex and super rich objects. I'm going to invite to our program my colleague, Dr. Alexandra Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is the manager of the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon, and our co-project lead on the Argo American Revolutionary Geographies online project. Alexandra, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. This is a delight. Just to echo Garrett, that was fantastic. And I too could just listen to you talk forever. And maybe just do that, but it's a fascinating, fantastic project, and really bringing light on some really fantastic cartographic objects as well.
We've just dropped a link to the Bouchet version of the Depinsier map that appears in Argo. It's on from our partners at Library and Archives Canada into the chat. So you can zoom in on it there. We can also bring back Julia's slides if we want to look at images some more. But as I said, Alexandra, Julia, and I are going to have a brief conversation, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. I already see that some folks have been dropping questions in the chat, so feel free to do so at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I'll maybe lead off the discussion, which I hope will be all three of us chiming in. But it's so interesting to me to see the way, Julia, that you kind of create a conversation between the symbolic or graphical representations of the map, right? The lines, the figures, even the way the text sort of arcs across somewhat arbitrary areas, and then the textual annotations in the map, the remarks, the clarifications, the attempts to sort of go beyond the geometric simplicity of the cartographic representation. Can you say more about, how those sorts of things, or those two elements of maps played out in other 18th century objects? What perhaps you think these were doing for in the legal status of these maps, right? Beyond just sort of hedging one's bets of saying, well, it's a little more complicated. How can we think about kind of graphic representation, textual representation as having a conversation with one another?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the way that I read it as a surveyor, like confronting the failure of spatial representation and sort of resorting to text. And that might just be because I'm actually, while I work with maps, I'm a very linear textual thinker. So that's relatable to me. And then I think probably the other way to think about it for me was reading his surveyor's notes, right? So when a surveyor goes out to make a map, the first thing they do is actually write a narrative, right? And so the narrative is kind of like a diary. Like it's like day one, I started at this spruce tree, like I stumbled through this cedar swamp, and then I located this other spruce tree, and I think it's such and such arpent away. And so then they sort of keep this notebook and then they refer back to this narrative in order to make the map. So in some ways, it's like the narrative is first and the map is second. So I think that made it easier for me to see how he's making the map, and he's just sort of like, I'm going back to narrative, because that's the sort of the raw note that he's working with. And I should say that also, so narrative is a big element in property mapping specifically, right? So in French Quebec, elsewhere, in medieval, early modern Europe, you would have what you would call like in French a procès-verbal, and essentially it's like you go out together and you walk the lines of the property and you sort of tell this story together of where the landmarks and the boundaries are, as a way of sort of like putting somebody in possession of their land. It's sort of done as it's sort of a ritual, and then then it's written down as a narrative. So the idea of property being spatially represented in some ways is something newer, yeah, and isn't really an early modern thing to do.
Yeah,
Which
like
is part of why it's so hard. Yeah.
the bounds festivals in early modern.
Yeah, exactly. Meets and bounds, right? And the idea that property is social, right? So your boundary ends where someone else's boundary begins, and where the boundary line really is about where you agree or don't agree on where it is.
There's actually there's some vestigial requirements for the city of Boston to conduct perambulation surveys of its juridical boundaries that, of course, derives from exactly the same things you're talking about.
Yeah, I've loved that when going through like town books in New England, they all have this requirement to every so often you have to go do the perambulation. You have to continue that early modern tradition, even if it's coming up against. Sometimes the product of this is a very kind of like clean, sure lines, but it's grounded in this social foundation, which is what you're drawing attention to, which is fascinating. So I have a question, which is sort of like a big standard question. I know that in your forthcoming book, Quebec is one of the areas that you look at. You also look at Louisiana and Southern California. And I know, at least in the case of Quebec and Louisiana, one of the things they have in common is this history of being kind of passed back and forth between imperial powers. And I think you laid out a very compelling case in your talk today about how, in some ways, that conquest paradoxically maybe made Indigenous claims visible. Do you think, is that something that we only see in certain places as what you're describing, kind of an exceptional situation, or is it just a case study as part of a larger, broader pattern that you see in a lot of places?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my larger book looks specifically about imperial property transitions in Quebec, Louisiana, and then Southern California. And what I'm looking at is essentially, these are all three places where Indigenous people end up without treaties because they're perceived to have already been conquered, right? And ending up without treaties it has pluses and minuses. Just to be clear, I'm not a big, advocate for. It has pros and cons. But what I find in my case study is that they end up entering, or I shouldn't say entering, they end up using the settler legal system in the sort of absence of treaties because they're already in the legal system, because of this French and Spanish history. And so when I conceived of the project, I was thinking about it as, these places are exceptional because these are places with French and Spanish legacies. And I think culturally today, they're sort of read that way, right? Louisiana, like Quebec, it has a very specific nationalist identity. Louisiana has a distinctive cultural thing. And then, Southern California, especially, we have what I call the romance of the ranchos, this sort of nostalgic image of our Spanish past. So that's what I initially thought, but actually, what I think is actually going on is that wherever you look, you will find Native peoples involved in land ownership, involved in the legal system, involved in property transactions, and that's because the treaty system itself is so capricious and changes so much, and is so inadequate for protecting Native territories and capturing Native nationhood. So, like, for example, we take something as classic as like removal in the 1830s of tribes from the Southeast. There's lots of folks who decide not to get removed to Oklahoma, and then they participate in the land tenure system and property ownership. So I think it's actually, I'm trying to sort of draw out this pattern with this imperial component, but the bigger pattern is that it's actually everywhere.
Yeah. And in I was really intrigued by the descriptions you have of the Odanak sort of appealing to the colonial juridical system. One thing I always find fascinating is when you sort of see these almost like collision of logics, right? Where Indigenous people are using sort of descriptions of usufruct rights or like the topological connections of things like river systems to describe really sophisticated territorial understandings, right? And I love how that challenges a sort of like pat narrative of, the native peoples of North America had no concept of territory before Europeans showed up, which of course is ridiculous.
Very silly. Yeah, they plainly did. Yeah.
And so so it's really interesting when you see these like appeals within the container of a European legal system, but they're actually making some really complicated and interesting moves about how they refer to territory or they describe territory. Are there any examples of the Odanak kind of doing that? Talking in a British register, but using Odanak interpretations of territory or rights.
Yeah, well, it's actually what they're doing is talking to the British in a French register about indigenous
interesting
conceptions. So basically, they seem to find a lot of things about seigneurialism, about French feudalism. Like, for example, French feudalism, you concede part of the lands, but then part of the lands you keep as a common. You have things like shared. Basically, there's usufruct elements of seigneurialism built in and familiar to the French that works pretty well for folks at Odanak. And so part of what they're sort of trying to advance to the British is to say, like, we're going to keep seigneurialism, because this really kind of works for us. But the distinction, what they're sort of always trying to say is, we're doing this as a nation, right? We are managing this collectively, right? We're a political entity that's managing a seigneury. They're sort of using this property container to advance an articulation of their political sovereignty. But then it gets more interesting, because I was like, okay, well, maybe they just like French feudalism, and they really, and let's say they don't like the sort of New England township model that gets imposed in Lower Canada in what's called the Eastern Townships, right? Turns out around the same time they get this map made, they also appeal to the British for a township grant.
Interesting.
And then they get a bunch of lots in this township. And I sort of spent all this time being like, why this township? Why this random township? And then I looked at the surveyor's notes for the township. And it turns out when the surveyor goes to lay out this township, there's a bunch of Abenakis there, and they give them all this information, right? They're basically like, oh, well, you can map that part, but that part of the river is going to flood in the summer. So like there's not going to be land here, for half the year, right? Again, they have all this sort of sophisticated knowledge. So they're also using the township system to reclaim this other important place. So that's my sense, is that they have this really flexible approach and sort of creative approach to the legal system that's really long term, right? So I mean, they're still very much in court today, and this is starting in the 1600s. And it's, so I really think of it as this, it's not about this sort of moment of conquest or moment of change in perception. It's about this real long-term survival through use of a legal system that's always changing.
Yeah, that raises an interesting question for me too, which you may or may not be able to answer, or may not have seen. Thinking about like Odanak and the Abenaki specifically, is they are in constant close communication with their relatives who are more on like what we now think of as the United States or British side of the border, with folks that are much more Massachusetts facing. Do you see them exchanging information, or like, because there's some sense in which in Odanak they already have a socialized or familiarization with what's going on in the British system even prior to the conquest? Is that my thinking? And then you can tell me if I'm wrong or if maybe I'm onto something.
Do I see them exchanging? No, but I would also say like I haven't looked for that, I would say, right? And there's definitely folks from Odanak who are traveling and going off to school and doing stuff like that. And I'm just over in a different category of records, the notarial records, to be specific. So that's kind of a non-answer, but it's possible. Yeah,
because I'm just saying that because I'm coming from a perspective of having done a fair amount of work on like Wabanaki communities in Maine, and sort of down towards Massachusetts and up towards Nova Scotia, where they're constantly talking about, going to say France's relatives in Odanak. And I just wonder what you'd see if you put those two things together. Like I said, this is an aside.
Sounds like a great article for you to write. Yeah.
I'm curious.
Who are you?
It's another piece that I found really fascinating is, at the same time as you're making these really interesting arguments about the Abenakis' understanding of territory and their ability to sophisticatedly shift into French and British colonial registers. It's also quite interesting to me to think about the European colonists themselves as like not thoroughly modernized, right? There's tensions even between like the colonials, sort of feudal seigneurial system, the vestiges of a kind of pre-modern English agricultural village in the township, and then these like modernizing states, right? The imperial administrators, the military governors. Do you see examples where European colonists or colonial, settler groups, corporate groups are kind of undergoing some of the same tensions about regularization and normalization that, for instance, the Abenaki are going through? Are there similar types of maps where it's not native territories that are the subject in question, but European settler territories?
Yeah. So I guess I think this sort of the idea that states have become these modern rational entities, I think is just overstated in general. Like, for example, in the US, we don't have a central property register. Like, there is no centralized place. Like, for property, it's still chain of title, right? It's still a narrative. So I think there's a lot of ways where I think historians, hopefully, and geographers are sort of evolving to come up with the reality of how organized that system sort of actually is.
Yeah.
And then, specifically in Quebec, like seigneurialism technically doesn't end until 1971. So and so I think one of the questions that I really grapple with in my work is you have these settler states, the US and Canada, and increasingly in the 19th century, um, they sort of start asserting their power, right? They're sort of say like, well, the law is like what we say it is, and we said the law was making treaties with Native peoples, but then we're not going to make treaties with these peoples, and then we're going to abolish the treaty process and just say that we have plenary power over Native peoples. And so the question that comes up for me is, if these states say that they can just do whatever they want, but they don't opt for clarity, right? They actually don't opt for consistency or regularity, right? And this, I think, is kind of a moment where, maybe not Depentier, but maybe Bouchette, when he made the copy of the map, could have been like, you know what, we need definite boundaries here. These are what the boundaries are going to be. We're the government. We make the boundaries, especially when it comes to Indigenous land, right? We have total jurisdiction over that, so we're going to do it. And they don't do that. And so then, sort of similarly with seigneurialism, in 1763, nobody really wants to get rid of seigneurialism, right? And there's a lot of British people who are like, this is fantastic. I mean, I am going to become a feudal lord myself. And then when they do sort of start to get serious in the 19th century about ending seigneurialism, they essentially bungle the process so badly in the 1850s that they have to do it again in the 1930s in such a way that it finally ends in 1971. So this isn't really a case of, it's not because of sort of the disempowered people are, clinging to the past. They're not, right? Abenakis are just demanding formalization. Actually, they want clarity, and it's the states that are sort of failing again and again to provide that, while saying that they alone have the power to do that.
It's really fascinating. Alexandra and I have been sort of hogging your time, Julia. I want to try to get to a couple of audience questions since we've got about 10 minutes left in the program. Again, if you're tuned in on either Facebook or YouTube, you should be able to drop questions in the chat. We'll try to get to some of them. I'll start with Amanda Zuretti, who is asking where are or were the land records archived that accompanied these maps. And Amanda follows up with another question saying, and land records must have been made to document seigneurial rights for both the French and Indigenous holders, no?
Yes. So yeah, this is a case of there's too many records. There's thousands of seigneurial property records just for Odanak. And these are notarial records. They're mostly in the Quebec archives in Montreal. Some of them are in Quebec City. Some of them are in Trois-Rivières. And also a lot of them are actually digitized. If you have time and you want to browse through thousands of notarial records. But so essentially this is a property system that's really decentralized. And so the idea is that a seigneur has what's called a procurer. So this is sort of kind of an attorney, not quite a lawyer, but you're sort of legal agent who works for you and manages your land records. And then that agent sometimes is a notary themselves, or they go in front of a notary and have their documents notarized. And that's sort of how those records enter what we would think of as sort of a state official group of records. So essentially there's thousands and thousands of land records, right? Leases, transfers of ownership. And then there's a lot of sort of narratives, like accounts of Abenaki tribal councils, where they're sort of talking about what they're going to do, appointing their land agent, and sort of talking about what his responsibilities are going to be. But in terms of are there records made by the state, like by the British state, that sort of lay out what seigneurial rights are? No, really. Like there's initial French seigneurial grants that sort of say like this is the responsibility of the seigneur, this is the responsibility of the tenant, but so much of property rights happens locally in the system. It's actually not even correct to call them rights, I think, because they're not like how we think of rights as something that's like guaranteed by the state. They're really like a series of sort of responsibilities and relationships that are being maintained by like copious record keeping on this very local level.
Can I just tag on to that? It's interesting just from a sort of pedagogical or even a broader sort of how do we engage with these topics. The notarial records can be pretty dense and pretty hard to parse through, and a map has this sort of like visual elegance to it. Seems to sum it all up in a single document. What do you think? For folks who are not maybe professional historians of the 18th century, if we think about just seeing a map of this, what does it both condense into a single image, but also what should we be careful about seeing only a map?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always suspicious. You got big straight lines, big spaces. People do not know. They don't know what they're talking about. I think it's always something to be suspicious of. And I have to say that especially at the beginning of this project, I read a lot of surveyors' notebooks, and it is just miserable. Like they are just lost. They're literally dragging a chain, like a heavy metal chain through a swamp. And so like I would say the experience of it is not one of sort of clarity and orientation, and so the fact that these maps get made at all is sort of amazing to me sometimes, and in that way I'm a little sympathetic. They can sort of be forgiven for their embellishments, but that's part of the why I love this map so much is because they really went for it, trying, like in some ways it's a very empirical map, right? It's really trying to represent reality on the ground and coming up against the limits of what a map can do.
Really fascinating. I can't wait to open it up again after the program and spend a while with my face right up against the screen.
I know.
Really
when you were first talking, I pulled it up in Argo, and I was kind of like, I had one half of my screen is you and one half of the map, and I was trying to follow along, and I was like, no, it's too messy actually to follow along. You're 100% correct.
We're nearly at the top of the hour, so I just want to say a few things about upcoming events. The next talk in the Richard H. Brown series is on October 22nd. It's with Professor Martin Bruckner of the University of Delaware, and it's entitled For the Love of Maps, Material Passion and Power in 18th Century America, where we'll think about maps as decorative and physical objects in the hands of 18th century folks. If you're local to Boston, we also have a couple of upcoming programs at the Central Library. In fact, this Friday is the opening day for our newest exhibition called Processing Place, How Computers and Cartographers Redrew Our World. And there are just a handful of tickets left for the opening reception of Processing Place next Tuesday, September 17th. We'll be posting the recording of this program on argomaps.org and on leventhalmap.org. On Argo, we'll also be pairing the talk with a handful of record objects of some of the maps that you saw Professor Lewandoski talk about today. Meanwhile, I encourage you to check out Professor Lewandoski's faculty page, and we drop some links where you can read more of her work. Do we have a guest date about the book itself when we can all get our hands on it?
That is a tough question to ask.
That's mean, Garrett.
Yeah.
You're just that excited.
You'll know when the pre-order is available,
Great.
And it will not be this year. Yeah.
Great. Well, today it just made me excited for more, and so I can't wait to read the whole thing.
So it's going to be a fantastic book.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, check out argomaps.org for many, many more both maps and cartographic materials from 18th century North America, as well as interpretive essays and collections about this topic. Please join me in thanking Professor Julia Lewandoski of the University of California, San Diego, for this amazing talk. We'll be sending out a link to the broadcast as well as a survey about the program. Thanks for joining us. Alexandra, Julia, thanks for being here, and I hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night, everyone.